But moving on, Boris Johnson and Tucker Carlson have sensationally scrapped a highly anticipated debate after a bit of a falling out. The two were scheduled to meet for an interview on Tucker's own channel, with Boris set to pocket £1 million, which he claims would be donated to Ukraine. But now the former Prime Minister has accused Carlson of acting as a tool for the Kremlin. The US broadcaster's interview with Russian President Vladimir Putin was watched by millions and millions of people. So what's this actually all about? A man who has his ear to the ground in Westminster is a Spectator's political correspondent, Mr James Heal, and he joins me now. James, a very good evening to you. Thanks very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. I mean, this sounds to me like it could be a number of different scenarios, right? So Tucker Carlson reaches out to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson says, give me £1 million and I'll do the interview. People who know Boris Johnson might say he might have wanted it for some new wallpaper or perhaps to do up the new house up in Oxfordshire. He's now claiming that he was asking for the money to give to a donation to a charitable organisation in Ukraine. What's it all about?
The answer is that it's about the future of the right within the transatlantic context here, which is that on the right in America, there's very much more a debate around, is Ukraine being used as a way to exploit American alliance to the Western community, or in Britain, where it's much more about, is that money being used to sort of keep up the Western alliance against Russia and their aggression forces? So really, it's about Boris Johnson's legacy and also about how the conservative forces across the Western world ought to stand. And in this election year, in 2024, when you have the debate about Ukraine being a real issue in America, 60 billion of aid being held up in the House of Representatives right now, in a way in which it's not really an issue so much here in the UK, where Keir Starmer's very keen to present himself as about an ally of Ukraine. It's very much more an issue about left versus right in America, whereas it isn't so much here. So it's more about different ways in which conservatism is going apart in DC versus here in London.
And is it also about how, despite the two having a common language, as Oscar Wilde said, there's a great deal of misunderstanding from the American perspective about British people, and probably similarly back the other way, because the American right doesn't really have a figure anything like Boris Johnson, a libertarian who likes free trade but also likes free movement of people, who doesn't wish to have borders, really wants to bring in as many people as possible, and he's as green as you can get. Net zero is his friend. I mean, I can't think of any Republicans who would fit that mould.
Yes, Mike, I mean, I completely agree. I think that with a lot of American right figures, it's very much more a checklist.
Yeah.
And it's much more, I can think of X, Y, Z. If you think of a person who was challenging for the Republican nomination, you think of people who are like, the Southern governor, Ron DeSantis, you could probably guess what they all were. Yeah. And in a way, Mike, that was what was his downfall, was that you could guess what Ron DeSantis thought about everything. Whereas in a way, Trump was unique because he was someone who would challenge those kind of vested interests. And similar with Boris Johnson is that, yes, he would say politically incorrect things about different groups in society, but also he was someone who signed up to the net zero agenda, who was fully behind COP26, who was someone who would be a strong ally of Ukraine. And that's what's really different about him here. And so I think perhaps in some ways that kind of willingness to go against orthodox opinions is what is being denied the American right at the current time.
Right. Also, Tucker Carlson is an interesting character, isn't he? Because he's kind of split the American right as well. Because there are those who think that he has done himself no favours by going to interview Vladimir Putin and getting very little out of him apart from a history lesson and a bit of propaganda and millions of views. But there's many on the, say, Trumpian side of the Republican right who have kind of disowned Tucker Carlson as a result.
Absolutely. And I think that's because they saw him going there as something that was beneficial to Vladimir Putin rather than actually trying to help the kind of cause of the American right here. Obviously, the American right has traditionally taken quite a nationalistic view of all these things, which is that America first. And by doing this interview in the way that he did it, with a 2-hour-long sit-down, that interview was perceived as being overtly helpful to Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
And one in which a lot of the points, the fair points about Putin's regime, have not landed well. And also, of course, Mike, coming just a week before the death of Navalny, which has obviously had this huge shockwave through a lot of the worldwide press here. And so I think that's what's really been so striking, is that I think Tucker Carlson's misreading of this, and also the timing as well. And that's why these two big egos, the great big, albino blonde bombshell of Boris Johnson, has come up against Tucker Carlson, who's probably in America the most formidable newsreader and presenter they have today.
Do you think there's any possibility that Boris was just sort of hanging one out there, if you like, and just going, I'll tell you what, think of a number, give me £1 million and I'll do the interview. And then it all went sort of horribly spiralling out of control.
I mean, that's not like Boris Johnson, is it? To get the numbers get horribly out of control. God forbid. Look, I think genuinely, Boris, I think people misread this, and I think that I saw a lot of criticism when Boris came out last month and effectively backed Trump, and I think that misunderstands it, right? Which is that Boris genuinely wants to support Ukraine, and rightly or wrongly, he is doing that in a way which he's trying to flatter Trump's ego, pandering to that ego in a way in which he's saying, look, Donald has to back Ukraine. That's the right thing. Donald's always backed the sort of way of virtuousness, etc. And that's what he's trying to do here. He's trying to suck up to Trump in a way in which he's trying to ingratiate himself. And so I think that when he says that, Donald Trump ought to back Zelensky's struggle, that's really what it's all about here. And so I think that Tucker Carlson has a different reading of the American right than what Boris Johnson does here. And I'll be interested with Liz Truss tomorrow going to CPAC, whether other British Americans, British conservatives will pick that up and try and make that case with the Americans when they talk to them, like Liz Truss is going to do tomorrow.
Yes. And Liz Truss, I suppose, is someone they can identify with because she's much more aligned with their kind of right-wing agenda, isn't she? She is a bit more kind of pure when it comes to things like free trade, but closed borders.
To an extent, I think the right in both countries is going through a bit of a struggle right now, which is that on the one hand, it's our country first, it's Britain first, it's America first in different contexts, but also it's about these kind of broad principles. And so everyone's really kind of, struggle with that right now. And I think that Liz Truss will go out there and she'll say, I was stopped by establishment. I think, she will say things about, the democracy, the will of the people was frustrated by what I went through. And there'll be a certain audience for that. But equally, what Liz Truss is quite interesting with is that she was very much more a supporter of Ukraine than a lot of the American right is right now. So it's about the key thing about saying, how does Ukraine's struggle relate to us as a people? And that will be an interesting argument I'll be looking forward to see tomorrow when she and others like Boris Johnson, the press, have been making, which is the case about, can Ukraine be an ally of Britain and America as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And just one final thing on Vladimir Putin. I mean, Tucker Carlson did ask him about Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who works for the same organisation that I do here. He's been detained yet again, remains in a Moscow prison, and is probably going to be there for another year by the looks of things. So, I mean, whether Tucker Carlson did any good there, I'm not quite sure.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think we all need to remember as journalists of different perspectives is that the way in which it's treated there is pretty chilling. And I will be interested to see whether that treatment of people involve the political or media struggle gets worse or better as that Russian presidential election gets closer. And it's a grim irony. I suspect that of all the many elections that are happening across the world this year, in Europe, America, elsewhere, India, for instance, I think that the Russian election is probably a foregone conclusion. And we just wait to see. Evan Gershkovich hopefully will have some kind of resolution there. And I think that's something to bear in mind when it comes to everyone dealing with Putin and Putin's Moscow.
Absolutely. James, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. James Hill from The Spectator there on the rather curious relationship between Tucker Carlson and Boris Johnson. We shall see. I wonder if Boris charges $1 million for every interview that he gives. Unlikely, I would have thought.